They were here with the author Dr. Nathan Bowling from the article Building a Bigger Toolbox, the construct validity of existing and proposed measures of careless responding to cognitive ability tests, published in the April 2025 issue of Organizational Research Methods Journal. Nathan, welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Thank you for setting up this discussion.
Thank you. And for our interview today, we'll talk about the background of the story, such as the author's motivations behind the paper and their experience with the review process, as well as their further thoughts on how to take this research forward. And to start us off, Nathan, can you give us a brief highlight of the article and how this article can help scholars in the research?
Absolutely. So this is a paper that I published with my PhD student, Mark Ramsey. Mark and I have long been interested in careless responding, primarily studying it in the context of careless responding to self-report measures. So think of like Likert type scales, for example. And so what we did with this paper is we tried to adapt some of the same ideas that have been used to measure careless responding to self-report measures to the context of ability tests. So in this paper, we focused on more ability-based measures. Think of measures of general mental ability, for instance, which are clearly very different from self-report measures. And so I guess the main focus of this paper is adapting some of those existing measures from the self-report literature to the ability testing literature. And our thought was this work on careless responding to ability tests is important because a lot of ability tests are administered in low stakes settings. So sometimes we collect data for organizational purposes from job incumbents where the incentive to respond carefully to ability tests may be minimal. So in those sort of low stakes settings, so think of concurrent validation studies, for example, this sort of issue may be especially a problem. And so having good tools to assess careless responding to ability tests is of great importance.
Could you tell us more about like the process of how this paper come into this current version? How did you and Marcus develop this paper together?
Yeah, so when Mark and I were first reviewing sort of possible ways of assessing careless responding to ability tests, we actually came across a literature in that has addressed this in educational psychology. It turns out IO, OB, HR hadn't given much attention to assessing careless responding to ability tests, but educational psychologists had. And they had looked at what we thought was a sort of a limited array of measures. They had focused primarily on response time measures of careless responding. So the idea there being that to respond carefully, there is a set of cognitive processes that a person has to execute, and those processes are time consuming. And if you bypass those processes, if you skip any of those processes, which we would assume is often the case with careless participants,
Mhm.
uh, if you're bypassing those processes, then your response times are likely to be suspiciously fast, which is
Mm,
also
yes.
an idea that we see in the literature that describes how to assess careless responding to self-report measures. So that was one thing that already appeared in the careless responding to ability test literature, and we also included that in our ORM article. Another existing index that educational psychologists have used to assess carelessness to ability tests has been to use a self-report approach. And so that approach is just simply to ask people at the end of a study if they put effort into the ability test items. And I think there's some pretty clear limitations to that approach. First off, you're sort of assuming that people who have a track record of being careless to
Mm,
an ability test will all of a sudden be careful and respond attentively to these self-report items. We think that's very unlikely. It's also the case that probably most attentive, or I'm sorry, most careless participants are likely to not be all that eager to share the fact that they've been careless. So even if they do closely read those self-report items, there's a social desirability problem here. They're unlikely to confess their own careless behavior. So we sort of assume going into this study that this existing index that a lot of educational psychologists use, the self-report index, probably isn't going to be very effective for those two reasons. Mark and I also introduced four additional indices that have been used to measure careless responding to self-report measures. We adapted those indices to this particular context of carelessness to ability tests. And this was sort of a novel aspect of our work, is introducing these four new indices. Just to kind of briefly go through those indices, one index we call the infrequency index,
Mm,
which basically involves giving participants what appear to be ability test items. They blend in with the actual ability test items, but these infrequency items are written to be exceptionally easy, and so easy that any attentive participant should give the correct answer. So just to give an example, we have one of these infrequency items that Mark and I wrote basically requires the participant to know that a kitten is a baby cat. That's how
mm,
easy the item actually is. And so if someone habitually provides the incorrect response to these infrequency items, it gives us some indication that they're likely not being attentive to the ability test measure. We've looked at some other things like instructed response indices. Those indices tell people what response to give. So they may essentially say, mark option C for this question. And so the obvious advantage of those kind of indices is coding them is really straightforward. If a participant habitually gives a response to these kind of instructed response items that is different from what we instructed, then that's a pretty obvious sign that they've not been attentive. A couple other indices that we've looked at in this paper, which again we've adapted from the careless responding to self-report measure literature. One is long strings. So looking for participants who give the same consecutive response to several different items. So someone responded with option C repeatedly on several
mm.
consecutive items. That's likely indicating that they're being inattentive. And then one final index that we've looked at is something called IRV, which is the uh, inter-item response variability index, which has been used in the careless responding literature when looking at um, participant behavior in response to self-report measures. So we've adapted it to this particular context of ability-based tests. And what the IRV really is all about is uh, the person's within-person standard deviation of responses. So if they give again the same response over and over and over again, that's some indication that they're being careless. So if they respond with C, 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 the IRV index is going to pick up on that. Um, so sort of our goal was to compare these what amount to six different indices, how well do they converge with each other, and how well they predict criteria that in theory an effective careless responding index should predict.
Yes, and it seems like there is a process from the adaptation from the character response literature for self-report and then the ability general ability. So could you share with us more about like how that process looked like and how the review process looked like as well?
Yeah, so for some of these indices, I think the translating them over from self-report measures to ability-based measures was pretty straightforward, although there's certainly nuances in this process. So I think probably one of the more obvious things is um, ability tests take, I would argue, more effort and more time to respond carefully to. And so when we examined the response time indices, we sort of assumed that it was going to take participants a bit more time to carefully respond to an ability-based item than it would to a self-report measure. So in the careless responding to self-report literature, there is an index my colleague Jason Wong introduced, where you essentially assume that it takes attentive participants a minimum of 2 seconds to respond to an individual self-report item. And I think it's safe to assume that 2 seconds is usually not enough to respond carefully to an ability-based item. So there's one of the
Yes.
nuances where we had to sort of tweak the existing indices a bit. So there are certainly nuances here. I think another part of your question was about the review process, correct?
Yes.
So for us, the biggest takeaway from uh, the revision process, and it's been a while, I have to kind of search my memory for some of the highlights from that process. But one of the things that really stood out is it became apparent after our first round of reviews that we needed to collect more data to adequately address the reviewer comments. If I remember correctly, the reviewer wasn't necessarily saying we had to collect more data, but reading between the lines, it became obvious to Mark and I that really to effectively address reviewer comments well, we needed to collect another data set. So fortunately, we had the time, we had the resources to collect one more data set. And if I remember right, that data set had to do with collecting criterion data. Most of our paper had focused, at least initially, on convergent validity. Sort of our argument was, well, we have a variety of different indices. They're all very different. Page time, response time is very different from self-report. Self-reported carelessness, which is very different from infrequency items, which is very different from long strings and IRV. So these superficially are very different indices, but if they all measure careless responding, then they should converge with each other.
Mhm.
And we found some evidence of that, but the reviewers wanted to see more. And really, to provide what the reviewers wanted, we needed to collect more data. So we collected the third data set. And that's really, I think, what got us over the finish line was that additional data set. So that additional data set, we added a criterion measure, which had to do with the inability to recognize the content of the measure the participants just completed. So the
Yes.
idea there, we actually quiz them, we give them a multiple choice quiz about some of the prior questions they had responded to. The idea being that if you're attentive, you should be able to recognize previous items. On the other hand, if you're careless, you won't be able to respond correctly to those recognition items. And so we had used that same sort of approach in prior papers examining careless responding to self-report measures. We had used that as a criterion measure. So we basically adapted that for this purpose and used it to basically assess uh, uh, inability to recognize content of the ability-based items. And we found that to be a really helpful criterion variable.
That's very interesting. And thank you for sharing with us kind of like the review process as well. And
Yeah,
during your work with this paper, what is your evaluation on the research around evaluating care responses in organizational research and also OB psychology and other
sure.
fields?
I think this is a problem that affects really any area of research within IO, OB, HR, any area where you're collecting data where you require your participants to be cooperative, which I think is probably pretty much any topic within our discipline. Um, this is going to be potentially a problem. Uh, so I think that's one of the things for this topic that really appeals to me is just how far-reaching careless responding is. Um, it's also, I think, kind of appealing that you can sort of be creative in how you approach it. It's that's been one of the fulfilling things about studying this topic is it's not necessarily something you can study very well just by asking people. You have to kind of look at what I see as much more interesting behaviors. You have to capture those behaviors during questionnaire completion or ability test completion. So capturing things like how much time people spend responding, or do people give goofy responses to easy questions? Or do people give the same answer over and over again? I think that ultimately watching people display certain behaviors can be much more interesting than just simply
Hmm.
asking them to report on their behavior. So I think that's been one of the things about this topic, not just the fact that it's relevant across substantive areas, but the fact that it gives a researcher a chance to be creative in how they approach the problem. Moving forward, I think there's a number of important questions that I hope to work on. I hope my graduate students work on, my collaborators work on with me. And I hope people in IO, OB, HR in general will tackle. I'm really looking forward into seeing where this field develops. But what I see as some of the more pressing issues is one, how do we prevent careless responding? We know it occurs. I feel like we can measure it pretty well. We know that it has undesirable effects on our findings. So it can do things like introduce random measurement error into our data, which will attenuate our findings, but it can also do the opposite in some situations. It can actually introduce common method bias into our data. That's especially a problem, not so much with ability testing, but more in uh, self-report measures. But we sometimes get the situation with self-report measures where carelessness introduces common method bias. And so if you have two measures that are self-report, X and Y, and if X and Y are both contaminated with careless responding, which
Mm.
can happen, you have this measure that's contaminated with careless responding, you have this other measure that's contaminated with careless responding. You're going to artificially inflate the relationship between the two. So we know that kind of effect can occur. So sometimes it attenuates effects, sometimes it artificially inflates effects.
Mm.
Um, so needless to say, careless responding has some undesirable effects on research conclusions. So these are sort of things we have solid evidence for. So I think moving forward, kind of the big questions that we still need to tackle are things like how do we prevent careless responding from happening? Is there anything we can do before we collect the data
Mm.
to prevent it? If we can encourage participants to be more attentive, that's going to benefit every researcher, regardless of the research topic that they're interested in. To date, we haven't had a whole lot of luck preventing careless responding. We've done things like warn people to not be careless. We've said things like, "Oh, we're going to be looking for careless participants, and if we find that you're careless, you're not going to get credit for being in our study." It turns out that sometimes works. It sometimes doesn't work.
Mm.
Even if it worked all the time, it's still problematic because in a lot of contexts, like an employee study or a study where the participants are customers, we want to threaten them with punishment.
Yes.
So that sort of prevention strategy is not always practical, and besides that, it often doesn't even work. So that would be one area where I would encourage researchers to pursue is how to prevent careless responding from occurring. I think another area where we need to give more attention is developing a theory of careless responding. Much of the work in this area has been atheoretical. I
Mm.
think a lot of the focus so far has been on measuring careless responding, identifying the effects of careless responding. That's been where the focus is, and that work has been, in my view, very atheoretical. So I would like to see researchers identify existing theory. They probably don't have to develop any new theory. It's just taking existing theory and applying it to
Mm.
this specific context and then testing that theory. I think that would make a huge contribution. And then one last area I'd like to see this field pursue is looking at with in-person change in careless responding over the course of an assessment session. So what we've done to date has primarily been at the between person level.
Mm,
So what I'm calling for is basically looking at changes in careless responding at the within person level during one testing session. I
mm,
think that would reveal some really interesting findings. I imagine what we would find is a lot of people over the course of a lengthy data collection, their attentiveness is likely to wane from, they may start off in general attentively, and then by the end, their attention may wane.
mm.
But I imagine we see different patterns across different people. Of course, you would have some people who maintain a high level of attentiveness from the start to the finish. You probably have some participants who start off careless and they never recover. But to date, that's not really the sort of thing we've been able to examine with the approaches, these between person approaches that we've taken.
This is a very interesting observations of how the work around examining careless responses are atheoretical and also on the between level. I think it's very interesting in how that can also help researcher like with the finding of like within person intention or trend of in careless response within a session can help better develop data collections that will be able to prevent those issues. So along with the future research directions, do you have any advice for scholars who are interested in studying about the tools to examine care response or like exploring the methods to prevent these from happening?
Well, one thing I've thought a lot about is advice I would give to any researcher who wants to use these indices. In our ORM paper, we found that response time and infrequency indices were two of the better indices. They outperformed the other four. I would certainly recommend using those indices in any study that's looking at focusing on ability assessments. But regardless of what kind of assessment you're going to use, I would recommend using multiple measures of carelessness and then finding some way to combine those into an overall index. An important issue too is if you're going to ultimately remove participants who are excessively careless, what I recommend doing is before you analyze your data, create an a priori cutoff that you can defend.
Mm,
And so what we want to avoid is researchers sort of after the fact analyzing their data and removing participants and saying, well, I don't like these results. I think I'll remove a few more participants. I don't like those results either. And just keep this process up until they like their findings. Of course, that capitalizes on chance. That's not a good research practice. What we instead want to do is prior to data collection, come up with an a priori cutoff that again, we want to be able to defend that cutoff and then stick with whatever that cutoff is.
I think that's an interesting point of coming up with a cutoff point um priori previous to analysis. And what do you think about coming up with those um should that be like before they even collect the data or should it be after they just take a brief look at the data? What is your opinion in that?
Well, I'll tell you what I do is I come up with these cutoffs before I do any data analysis. Just to make it, I mean, I think that's really best practice. Come up with those. Don't look at the data first. Come up with your cutoffs, and um, then use whatever that cutoff is.
Yes. Thank you very much for the advice and also sharing your experience uh, completing this paper and the review process. Is there any thought that you would want to share with the audience that we have not covered today?
No, I think kind of looking more broadly, I would encourage researchers to pursue topics that have wide-ranging implications. Again, that's one of the things about this topic that appeals to me. And I think that's probably true of a lot of research methodology topics. If you can find some important methodological question that cuts across different substantive areas in IO and OB and HR, that's a sign you potentially have a fruitful research topic on your hands. I think another piece of advice I give to researchers, and I've certainly had this experience studying careless responding, is if you can find a topic that lends itself to very actionable sorts of outcomes. If you can find a topic, in other words, that you can do research on where that research will yield immediately actionable um, suggestions that you can give to other researchers or to practitioners, I find that really rewarding. I've certainly experienced that with this body of research where you publish a paper and there's very specific actionable things that come out of that paper, like how to measure careless responding. Uh, so I see that, and I know not all research can necessarily yield immediately actionable findings. A lot of research doesn't, and that's okay. But at least for me, I would give that advice to my students and to really anyone. Think about doing research that has the potential to lead to immediately actionable outcomes.
Yes, and kind of like having that practicality, the actionable items and advice as the end goal of their
Yeah,
research.
yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much for your time again today,
Well, thank
Nathan, and
you.
also your work in this literature in examining careless responses and providing the toolbox for scholars to evaluate these responses and assist with their research.
Sure, absolutely. And thank you for your time and setting up this interview. And I'm always interested in chatting with any researchers out there who'd want to collaborate or just talk about this topic. They could feel free to email me at my UCF email address.
Yes, thank you very much.